And I had not gotten an egg to develop before I had left. And when I came back from South Africa, I had weighed that female and said, they dropped weight. There have to be eggs in here. I dug them up and all of them were developing. And so that totally shifted my incubation, and is really the root of my incubation now. So I always say the first Hinge-Back I hatched is totally credit to my wife, while she was taking care
Missing
of
the
the
clutch.
production. Yeah, absolutely. Seeing that success when I came back on top of 3 weeks in the bush, totally focused on Hinge-Back tortoises with the guy who is like the godfather of Hinge-Back tortoises. So, you know, all of that together, I came back and was like, I looked for folks who could take on the other species that I was working with.
Welcome to episode number 144 of the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you very much for tuning in today. Today, I'm speaking with Jeremy Thompson, who is the founder of the Kinixys Cooperative. Several of you have reached out to me to have Jeremy on, and I can see why, because he's up to some pretty incredible things. This episode actually really reminds me of episode number 96 that I did with Nick Gordon of the Abroni Alliance. I'll put that in the show notes as well, because Jeremy gives us this fantastic framework for how to find a genus or species that you enjoy working with, then how to attack the preservation, the conservation, and the education piece of that species. Now, it is so important that as a community, not all of us, but some of us are approaching keeping reptiles with a very conscientious mindset, and that's exactly what Jeremy's doing. The Kinixys Cooperative allows him to work with the species, actively participate in conservation, actively participate in preservation, and also actively participate in education. And these are the types of initiatives that really show outsiders that herpetoculture is a serious activity. It's not just a hobby that we're doing on the side. It is something that we are very passionate about and something that we are attempting to make the world better by participating in. And even though that might sound really sort of grandiose for many people, but I think many of us listening to this, or many of you listening to this podcast, have those same type of visions. We have visions of making the world better by keeping and caring for animals in captivity. And Jeremy lays out a perfect template for how to do that. And I know you will enjoy this episode. If you're looking for more information on this episode, make sure you head to animalsathomenetwork.com. There you find the show notes. All the links and things that are mentioned in this episode will be there. If you would like to join us over on Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/animalsathome. For as little as $3 a month, you can help support the podcast and also jump into the Discord server and have conversations with other listeners as well. And thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring this podcast. You can find an affiliate link in both the show notes and the YouTube description. And if you are enjoying the podcast, one of the easiest ways you can help the show out is by promoting it on social media, either sharing it on Facebook or Instagram, or even giving us a rating or a review on either Spotify or Apple. That really does go a long way for visibility in the audio-only platforms apps, so that does help us quite a lot. And I think that is it. I know everyone here is going to enjoy this episode, so let's just jump into it. Enjoy. All right, well, Jeremy, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm definitely looking forward to chatting with you. You are someone that's been requested a couple of times by the listeners, so there's for sure a couple of listeners that are cheering right now because they've been looking forward to this. I think you've been on my list for a long time, so I'm glad that we were able to do it. And as we were just saying off air, I think the model that you have with what you're doing is something that is a good template for other herpetoculturalists and something that we can do as a community together. Working on different species, and I think it's very positive. So I kind of want to start with, maybe you could just quickly talk about how you got into reptiles or how you got interested, but then you can maybe fold in Kinixys in general, just to set the template, because people may not be familiar with the genus, just so people listening have a good understanding of what we're talking about.
Sure. So since I can remember, I've been interested in reptiles, nature, animals, all that sort of stuff. I grew up, going to Barnes and Noble with the family, looking through, reptile books and herping with my dad and brother. So, as far as the hobby goes, it just snowballed. It's, going out herping. I grew up in Southwest Florida, so the herping scene was pretty solid there. And Benita Gala, who owns Gala's Reptiles, she's closed down since, but it was like a little awesome mom and pop reptile store that was just down the road from me. And she's definitely who kind of thrust me into the hobby. Before I had met Benita, I didn't even realize, all of what was out there. It was really just exposed to the local stuff. So that's kind of my start in reptiles in general. And I shifted through working with snake species, lizards, and landed on tortoises. And then further narrowed myself to working with Hinge-Back tortoises. So Hinge-Backs, or Kinixys, which is the genus name, is what I decided to focus on. There's a kind of winding road that got me there. But, I was working with Mineria, so like mountain tortoises, impressed tortoises, Pyxis, spider tortoises, and Spangleri. And I had a colony of Egyptian tortoises and was just kind of trying to find my way and focus on something that needed some more help. So, I think there was a kind of a philosophical shift in my keeping from, when I was working with snakes and I was in college, I was totally focused on the business side of the hobby and, worked with snakes to, help pay bills and kind of grew that business with my dad. And then as I sold off my collection and moved and refocused, I was searching for that group of animals that I could take seriously.
So when you say take seriously, you were looking for something that, like, as you said, needed help, something that maybe was endangered, or was there sort of a list in your head, that check marks that you were looking for a species to hit?
Yeah. So when I first met my wife at the beginning of college, she reminds me all the time that when we first met, you kept saying like you wanted to help an endangered species in some way. And I look back on that now and almost chuckle because I have a different perspective on what I thought I wanted to do and what I am doing now, and the ability of a private keeper to dabble in things like education or preservation or conservation and what those terms mean and what I thought they meant. So, getting into tortoises in general, I think it's having been a part of many different sectors of the hobby over the years. The tortoise part of the hobby, at least in the United States, feels a lot different to me. Words like preservation and conservation, I feel like were thrown around in the tortoise sector pretty openly and freely. And I never really heard those terms really thrown around in the other parts of the hobby. So that's kind of what drew me towards tortoises. I also really love the enclosure side of keeping. And so when I was keeping snakes in racks, I still have some snakes and I do keep them in racks. So I have nothing against rack keeping, but it didn't scratch that itch for me to put together, a facility that I'm proud of, an enclosure that I'm proud of. And that's what pulled me towards tortoises.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting the way, like you said, preservation and conservation is kind of a staple in turtle and tortoise keeping, maybe more tortoise than turtle. And you're right, on the other side, the reptile side, snakes and lizards doesn't pop up as often. And I think I don't even know why that is. I think a lot of the species in the world are endangered, so maybe it comes with the package. I don't know. Do you think there's a specific reason that tends to be more of a focus?
I see bleed over in the tortoise hobby with institutions and zoos and like different facilities that are working on species. And then there's also the private sector working with those organizations. So maybe we pull those terms from, organizations like the Turtle Conservancy or the Turtle Survival Alliance or the Turtle Room or TTPG, which is the Turtle and Tortoise Preservation Group. You have those organizations that are already working, either in situ or ex situ on those species, and the private keepers are trying to be part of that.
Mm. Yeah, it must be like, for some reason when you think of tortoise keeping, it does seem more professional just from just the way I think about it, right? And I think that's the way a lot of hobbyists think of it as well. And maybe it's just due to the type of animal you're keeping. You're keeping something that's slower, methodical. You're not really, there's no morphs being folded into the picture really, and it doesn't bode well for like impulse buying and impulse keeping, I don't think. Maybe in some cases it does, but I think the reptile side, especially snakes, really lends itself to impulse buying and crazy collections, where the tortoise side doesn't seem to do that as much.
I think that's totally true. And turtles in general, I think it's the most endangered vertebrate as a group on the planet. So that definitely adds to turtles and tortoises being part of that conservation talk. But as far as keeping, you can't be in a hurry. So towards what you just said, where, as a snake breeder, I could produce a colubrid and raise the young up quickly and reproduce the next generation, especially with tortoises and turtles. That's just not possible. You have to have the longer term vision. You have to have the patience. You have to be willing to take on a species and see it through over a long period of time. And yeah, there are definitely folks, like myself included, right? I mentioned 4 groups of tortoises that I don't keep anymore. But you're not going to succeed that way in the tortoise hobby. You have to focus long term, because these guys can take very long to raise up and even incubate. I see, snake friends will send me a picture and say, I got eggs from this species and they take so long to incubate. And they're talking about an incubation that's 120 days or less, where a lot of tortoise folks can be sitting on eggs like myself that are 300 plus days to incubate.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's way more patience involved.
Yeah, yeah. And there are obviously great keepers all through the hobby that have focused in on something and done a great job with them, not just in turtles and tortoises.
I'm kind of curious, just jumping back, when you were talking about when you were early in your college years, you were sort of conceptualizing what working with an endangered species felt like, and what that work actually actively was. And now that you're doing it, it's very different. So was it just a sort of a naive approach, or how different are those two worlds?
Yeah, it was definitely a naive approach. I think, in my head, I wanted to save a species or something of the like. And really getting involved in Hinge-Back tortoises and meeting folks who are doing research and conservation in their native range, partnering with organizations and institutions that work with these guys, like universities and zoos. It really humbles you. You think, I don't want to say you think you're doing something more and you realize that you're not. However, I think it's a nuanced shift where you thought, I'm going to save a species all by myself. And you realize that in order for me personally as a private keeper, with, my abilities to do conservation, it's more or less contributing in some way to folks who are. So I don't consider anything that I'm doing at the Kinixys Cooperative conservation. None of what I work with will ever end up back in their native range. And I think in the tortoise hobby, there's maybe a false carrot that's put out there, that I think some folks think that they are doing conservation and that they will be, that maybe one day these will be repatriated. And that would be awesome if that's the case. However, myself, I think it's more important to focus on the people, like, someone that I went to South Africa with, Dr. Flora Elo. She's doing actual research on Hinge-Back tortoises. She's dedicated 6 years of her life to it. folks like her, and there's other folks who are in Western Africa doing research as well. Folks that are protecting land. It's those folks who are doing conservation in my mind, and my role could be, financially supporting them, sharing their work, giving them a platform to, share their work. And then, it's a shift from conservation to preservation as far as the private sector goes, I think.
Yeah, it is such an important point, and I think that's so right. The private sector really plays a supportive role in conservation, but we have a massive amount of support, and that was one of the things, because I support a conservation with the podcast, and originally people who listen to this podcast know this story, but when I approached them to ask if I could make monthly donations with some of the income that I make from the podcast, they didn't want it because they don't want to be associated with the pet trade, right? We all know that story. And so, but I convinced them that there's actually a giant group of people who are desperately in love with these animals and are absolutely willing to help, even if it's $1 a month or something like that. And so we have this like army of reptile and people that are just amazed with these animals, and we can utilize that to help these conservation groups and do our best to be responsible and whatnot from our end. But there are a lot of keepers who think that because they're breeding in their house that they're actually doing conservation. It's like, well, that's not really true, and it also doesn't make us look good when we actually talk to real conservationists, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's you can have the view of what you're doing on an island, but as soon as you go to one of these conferences or you spend time with folks who are in the thick of it, it's not belittling the private sector at all. Like, you sharing the power of that army to support conservation. Flora, when I came back from South Africa, I had said to her, I want to help fund your next trip. I went out there for many reasons, one of which was to really see her work on the ground in person and know that the person that I'm backing is doing something that I want to support. And, I came back from South Africa really inspired by everything that she was doing there. And I said, I'm going to try and raise some money for your next trip. And honestly, she kind of laughed and was like, I mean, that sounds sweet, but, I don't think she had belief in the private sector at the time, for good cause. And, I did a simple, like, it was this t-shirt actually. I was like, yeah, I'll do a t-shirt fundraiser. We'll see if we can raise a couple bucks. And as soon as I put it out there, the tortoise community as a whole came together, and we had 3 different people just throw a $500 donation at the cause. It wasn't about the t-shirt. It wasn't about, it wasn't about that. It was, this is an opportunity for me as a keeper to support actual conservation through somebody who, went there and saw it and can speak firsthand. And, Flora was like in tears when I called her and told her what we raised. And, she definitely appreciates the support of the community.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. So I want to get into the South Africa thing in a second, but first, as far as the genus goes, you had talked about it was kind of a winding road that brought you there. Do you remember when you first kind of discovered this genus? Have you been aware of them for a while when you were already working with the Egyptians and the others?
So the first time I had actually heard of them was when I was at Ralph Till's house, who is an awesome Egyptian tortoise keeper in Florida. And I had purchased Egyptian tortoises from him. This was back in 2016, I believe. And, he had just mentioned that a friend of his had Hinge-Back tortoises, and that, I was interested in keeping something and, had the idea of helping out with conservation. And he had said, not a lot of people work with Hinge-Backs. Have you ever considered them? And I don't even know if he remembers saying that, but that was my first exposure. And then I went digging. I found David Mifsud, who really is the pillar. Him, Dwight Lawson, Will Aarons, James Badman. I'm sure I'm missing folks, but those are, at least for me personally, were pillars for Hinge-Back tortoises. And I reached out to them and just said, hey, this is what I'm interested in doing. And I'd love to build groups. And as soon as I got my first ones, I kept focusing more and more. And, we'll talk about South Africa in a minute, but South Africa had a big impact on the Kinixys Cooperative and why I started it.
So how big was your colony of Hinge-Backs before the South Africa trip came into existence?
10 or 15 animals, and all captive born animals except for a couple really long-term captive wild caughts.
And how many species?
It was 4 species.
Okay.
Yeah, 4 species. And yeah.
So at that time, was the Kinixys Cooperative a thing yet? Or no, it was not you hadn't even created it yet.
I hadn't created it yet. And my first trip was 2018. And then my next trip was at the end of 2019.
Okay.
So by the second trip, it was after the first trip, it was full on. And then definitely after the second trip was more when I formulated it and gave it a name. But that child was born really after the first trip.
So let's talk about that first trip, because I think that's where it seems like a lot of the sparks kind of started flying. So how did you go about that? You have this group of tortoises, and then you're like, I need to go to South Africa. Were you just looking for someone who was going or studying them, or how did this work?
Yeah, so it's something that I think outside of Hinge-Backs is important. It's, maybe advice, but just sharing experiences that when I reached out to David Mifsud, because I have a lot of folks now that reach out to me as well. When I reached out to him, I was a total newbie. This was early 2017, February of 2017, I believe. And I said, I'd love to work with these guys. He recommended Captive Born, which is a great, great idea for someone who's new. And I basically reached out and said, these are the resources that I've found to learn about them. Are there any others that you would recommend? He had written the Kinixys Conservation Blueprint, which was a long document about ecology, potential threats in the wild, and husbandry, and said, here, read this, study this, and come back to me. So I think the nugget there is I definitely see, I welcome new folks absolutely into Hinge-Backs, and I think that they can do great with them. I would say, I think that David took me under his wing, and I share this story because he's the one who invited me to South Africa the first time. I think he took me under his wing and saw this is someone who could, make an impact on Hinge-Back tortoises in the US, because I had done my homework. Even though he didn't know me from Sam, I had done my homework before approaching him. He kicked back to me saying, hey, this is what you need to know. I studied that document, and then, also was initially a good customer of his. I purchased my stock from him. I paid full price. And I think that those little tiny threads matter when you're reaching out to the person who is focused on that species. And we have that all of the industry. Fortunately, that person where you're like, if you want X, Y, or Z, this is the person you go to. And I would imagine that those folks really get bombarded by newcomers and
Oh yeah.
newcomers that are not, maybe not doing their homework before they reach out.
First impressions are crucial, important, and it's pretty easy for someone to tell if someone's done their research or not. Just the way you phrase a question could be, okay, this person has not read anything yet. They just want a new tortoise. And so that makes a lot of sense that you kind of earned his respect quite quickly. And then, so did he go to South Africa as well, or he was already connected with some of these researchers?
So he was planning a trip, and it was really a trip to try and see the 4 species that exist in South Africa, the 4 Hinge-Back species. And I actually went back because it's foggy on how I actually and why I got invited. I went back through old messages looking at why did he take me along? And yeah, I mean, at some point it was just, I'm going. We had never met in person. The first time I met David in person was at the airport,
Oh,
ready.
wow.
Yeah, ready to fly out to South Africa.
So he wasn't local to you. For some reason, I was thinking he was local. He was shipping you animals when you were buying them from him.
Yes, yeah, he was in Michigan and I was in Florida.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, so really it was just, almost a year of going back and forth from February of 2017 and we went in March of 2018. And it was just a year of really, bonding with him about Hinge-Back tortoises. And, he saw that I had that vigor and I was still keeping some other stuff. And, it'd be interesting to ask him exactly what, prompted the invite. But he invited me and we went out there for 3 weeks.
Was it just the two of you?
It was the two of us and then Paul Rabiega, who's a South African who we had connected with to help us kind of like sort out where we needed to go and where we might find stuff.
And tell us about the trip. Like, how was it?
It was awesome. It definitely changed my life and changed me as a keeper. So, we went all over. We found 3 of the 4 species. There's plenty of those stories of, spending 14 hours looking for one tortoise day after day until you find one. We went not at a great time of year for finding hingebacks, but that was just when our, schedules lined up and when we could go. And yeah, just seeing them in their native range, seeing their habitat, experiencing the temperatures there, getting to see fecals, all that sorts of stuff kind of started to shape in my head what I ought to be doing and maybe what I was or wasn't doing right. And, while I was away, I had my first Kinixys eggs develop. And I've told this story once before, but essentially my wife was taking care of the collection and I had her collecting eggs. That was egg laying season. And she had missed 2 nests in a Kinixys homiana enclosure and in 2 different enclosures. And I had not gotten an egg to develop before I had left. And when I came back from South Africa, I had weighed that female and said, they dropped weight. There have to be eggs in here. I dug them up and all of them were developing. And so that totally shifted my incubation, and is really the root of my incubation now. So I always say the first hingeback I hatched is totally credit to my wife, while she was taking care
Missing
of
the
the
clutch.
collection. Yeah, absolutely. So, there was, seeing that success when I came back on top of, 3 weeks in the bush, totally focused on hingeback tortoises with the guy who is like the godfather of hingeback tortoises. So, all of that together, I came back and was like, I looked for folks who could take on the other species that I was working with.
Yeah, you came back laser focused basically on this one task. So your passion for them just grew while you were there. Was there just things just about being in their environment or things that you saw while you were watching them in the wild that just refined the focus even more? Or what was it about that experience that gave you more potent passion?
I think honestly, we saw, I don't know the exact number, but less than 15 hingebacks while we were there for 3 weeks. We weren't there again in perfect time, but it became clearer and clearer to me when I went to South Africa, which, 4 of the 9 species or subspecies exist there. The rest are throughout Africa and one in Madagascar. So it's not like all of the hingebacks are in South Africa, but when I was there, I got to see a really fragmented environment for them. Every piece of land is fenced and claimed, electric fencing with tortoises deceased at the bottom of the electric fence. Like literally every piece of land that I saw while I was in South Africa, and we were all over the country. We even made it down to the Cape, which is not where hingebacks exist, but we met with 2 really awesome researchers there. It's all fenced and someone's staking claim to that property, and it's hard to get on private land. So, I left there feeling like, wow, these guys really do need focus. We need somebody. At the time, I wasn't aware of Flora Elo. She was already working there at the time. But, I was like, these really do need someone to focus on them. They're not doing great. Their numbers are not high. You can find them at markets in South Africa. And, finding my first one, which was a Kinixys lobatiana, I just fell in love. It's like that habitat was just absolutely gorgeous. That tortoise was just marching around, doing its thing. And we were able to find Speckeye later and then Zombensis after that. And, especially that first tortoise or Hinge-Back that I found myself in the wild, it just, yeah, that changes you.
So it was a sort of a mixture of seeing them, in their wild habitat, but also seeing the destruction that they're experiencing that kind of made you go, okay, I need to do something. Was there immediate changes you made to husbandry after having boots on the ground in their habitat?
Yeah, that's a good question. And when I came back from South Africa, especially the second time, I came back after being with a researcher who has data loggers at the correct, we can all look at weather data,
Mm-hmm.
but Flora has data loggers at tortoise height off the ground. She has data loggers by burrows that they're using. She has a lot more information, and she was happy to share that. That helped me dictate like these are where my temperature parameters ought to be. um, and then seeing stuff like, what's in their fecals, they're eating millipedes, all that sorts of stuff. So, temperature, incubation, which was just coming home to realizing that ambient incubation at a much lower temperature than I thought is what they need. And, seeing diet, all that sorts of stuff definitely, informed my husbandry. But I also came back like, wow, they live in this vast, awesome area. Like Speckeye are marching around, they're using burrows, and we don't know exactly how big their ranges are, but they're pretty active at dawn and dusk. And I came back thinking my enclosures are too small. I need way bigger enclosures, lavish, decorative enclosures. And I had two people who I respect a lot basically say to me, and this was after my second trip. So I had already hatched out multiple species and I was starting to kind of gather momentum hatching these guys. And they both said to me, as far as the wild caught tortoises go, they're so hard to establish and there are very few people hatching these guys out. Go with what's working.
Mm-hmm.
You can have them like I still, all of us, myself and a couple close friends who started the working group, like we mention often that, you know, it would be great to put them in a greenhouse. There's one facility succeeding with a greenhouse, but for the most part, they don't do well outside. They need to be kept indoors throughout the country. That's definitely my recommendation. And it's like what's working, just keep rocking. So
Mm-hmm.
it's maybe a little, selfish or dark, but I see the wild caughts as, if I could have it my way, they'd still be marching around in the wild.
Yeah.
Any wild caught that comes in that perishes, like you feel that as a keeper, and you're like, if people hadn't messed with it, it would still be doing its thing. It's probably 20 years old and it was living its happy tortoise life before we collected it.
Yeah.
But, I almost see the wild caughts as, um, they have a sacrifice that they make to get that species established in the hobby. And why are they established in the hobby? It's really just a private keeper or a group of keepers that are interested and want to work with them. Again, there's no conservation value. I would say there's preservation value. If these guys disappear completely, at least there are some in the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
And that's happened with a couple species of turtles and tortoises where they're functionally extinct in the wild, but thankfully zoos, institutions, and private keepers have kept them around. But, as far as the conservation value, it's not there. So those wild caught tortoises, my approach is to keep them in a way that they're thriving and they're reproducing. And, that ends up being a simple setup for Hinge-Back tortoises.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you're dealing with a species that doesn't, it's not like they're breeding like rats where you just get a whole, a bunch of clutches or a bunch of litters, whatever you're working with all the time. I totally get what they're saying. Like, it's working. Don't mess with it, because right now we need more of them, right? You just need to continue building the colony until there's more of a stability. And normally generations down the line, sometimes these things, captive bred animals become more robust and they can handle certain things, but certainly wild caught animals, sometimes if it works, it works. And so are you working with lots of wild caught animals? Do they come in quite often, or how does that work?
So they used to come in a lot. They come in way less now, which, like, since 2018, very few have come in. One of the species got cut off because Mozambique got cut off.
Mm.
But as far as, wild caught animals, captive born are just a totally different animal. So a wild caught Kinixys arosa can be a nightmare. Some people have had success. I've had success establishing them. But captive born are super hardy. It's a species that I would maybe not suggest to a total beginner, but I would suggest to an intermediate keeper who's kept other tortoises before. And, I got introduced to Hinge-Backs with captive born animals. And so I had a positive first interaction. There are folks who are amazing keepers that go to TTPG every year, the conference, and, they'll share their story with me. And these are guys I look up to and respect. And they'll say, I tried working with those and I totally failed. It was a nightmare. You're doing a great job. And I always ask, were they wild caught? And, in some cases, I've pestered those folks to take on captive born, saying, like, they're not the nightmare that you think. Captive born are great. And that's, once you have F1s on the ground, so first generation captive born, you've got at least 1 foot in the door to getting that species established. And, I listened to, the Project Herpetoculture podcast with Philippe de Vaugelet on my way home today. And he said, from few, many, talking about, the old mentality of someone who's passionate about a species. I think he mentioned back in the 80s, plucking some from the wild and bringing them home. And they weren't importing 2,000. They weren't importing 300. They were taking a couple. And then from there, building the captive colony. So, while Hinge-Back tortoises definitely came in droves, most of them failed. And I think not even, when I heard him say that, you can think about what's imported and then what's established. But I also think about what the individual keeper chooses to set up, how serious they take each of those individual animals, and what is their success rate. Because a lot of folks that I know who set them up, their approach was, let me get 50 and maybe 3 will live. Mm-hmm. The Kinixys Negui that are here in the country have not been imported since 2000. And every single one of the wild caughts that are at my facility are from giant imports. And, plenty of folks who are not at all involved in the turtle and tortoise hobby have reached out to myself or others saying, hey, I've had this one Negui or this one Zombensis for 29 years, and I'm looking to place it, in your breeding program. It's these lone survivors from the model of, it was from many few, because they took on 100 and 2 survived. And, my approach is the opposite. My approach is take on a couple. Like, the first Arosa I established was 1 trio. It was a big shipment and I could have taken on 40 of them, but I took on 3, and, those have reproduced great for me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's some of the sort of the darker side of our hobby and herpetoculture in general, is that we do have this like pillage mindset, and a lot of people listening to this show don't have that, but that exists big time within our hobby. And exactly, it's from many few. It's like the R breeding or a reproduction strategy, right? When you have these animals that make 1,000 babies and like 10 live or whatever, that is not how we want to be pulling wild caught animals out of the wild. It makes no sense. And a lot of times those people aren't even focused on those species, right? They'll just like bring in 50 and like you said, it's just, there's disease, whatever, they'll die off and hopefully a couple float to the top and we can get them to go. But it's absolutely the wrong mindset. And that's where we lose a lot of credibility within the public sector.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's set up a bunch, hope they survive. And, I think when I went to Ralph Till's house, what I saw there was the first turtle and tortoise keeper personally with my own eyes who was keeping their adults individually. And I took that and ran with it. So I every time someone asks, why do you keep your Kinixys individually? They can be nasty with each other. They can kill each other, males and females. I think in groups, at least most of the species are living under a constant state of stress. So they're coming from the wild. These guys are not hanging out in burrows together in the wild. Like, it's a solitary animal, at least the species that I got to see in South Africa. And not only do folks grab 50 and set them up, but it's 50 all together.
Cohabbed, yeah. In
an outdoor pen. It's throwing everything negative. It's not giving them the chance to succeed, in my opinion. So, I stole from Ralph Till, keep them individually. That's how I've done. At Kinixys Arosa do seem to do great in trios. I've never really had aggression. Even males occasionally will be totally fine. I don't house males together, but, Ralph Till houses his Egyptian tortoises separately and pairs males to get them riled up for combat, and then they want to go breed. And so I've done that as well with Hinge-Back tortoises, and some Arosa are just looking at the other male like, hey, I don't care.
They're just hanging out now.
Yeah. But everybody else, I think it's a lot. I say often that Hinge-Back tortoises come, at least having a big wild caught collection and managing the Kinixys Cooperative comes with an inherent level of stress as a keeper. I think I have that burden of stress all the time, 24/7. And, keeping them individually lowers that tenfold. I'm not worried about when I get home, are they going to have beat each other up? You can see who's eating, who's defecating, what that looks like. If you need a treat, you can treat an animal. So I'm really in favor of folks taking a look at any species that they work with. We're talking about Hinge-Backs, but this really goes across the board. I also work with prehensile tailed skinks and Agurnia on a smaller level. And, those are very communal animals. But those animals that are solitary in the wild that we shove together in a cage with another animal, it's not setting them up for success.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as far as the common failures that other keepers are experiencing with wild-caught Kinixys, you mentioned a few, the cohabbing and, all that, all the sort of negative, the classic mass importer situation. But, you talked about some of those breeders or keepers that you highly respect who are very smart and sophisticated keepers who are struggling with wild-caught. What sort of things, where were they failing and how did the simplified setup fix those errors?
Yeah, so I don't think that it's totally a case of always keeper error. Like, these guys definitely come in horrible condition. Like, an adult male Arosa coming in lighter than a 2-year-old captive born Arosa that I've hatched here, literally. Wow. Like that light. So, a lot of the Arosa come in with tether holes drilled in their shells. So they were, hung or tethered at a meat market, and that's where they're picked up. So how long were they there before they got moved to an export facility? I got to see a market that had Kinixys lavatiana in South Africa and how those were kept and how horrible condition. Like, Flora even struggled to draw blood from those tortoises because she was
dehydrated.
Yeah, she was doing research, right? So she's taking blood samples, but so I don't think it's just a failure of those keepers to set them up right, but I'm not aware of anybody setting up individual animals. All of those folks who I'm mentioning who are amazing keepers who breed really rare stuff, set them up in groups or set them up outside. But even indoors in perfect conditions, you mentioned, that graveyard that folks have, and it is totally a part of keeping wild caught hingeback tortoises. It's the depressing part, and it's part that people don't really talk about or share. You share your success and when you hatch stuff and all that, but a lot of folks don't realize what it takes to set up those groups. And definitely, every Ngui that's around in the country, or every Zombensis, which is very few, being someone who knows what an import looks like, you see that one Zombensis and you're like, you are around, but 500 of your, population also came in and they're not around. So, but it's getting so much better. Folks are more educated. Folks are open to keeping them indoors. For a tortoise keeper, a lot of folks love to keep them outside, myself included. Like, mountain tortoises are great for my area outside, and it's awesome to see them in a naturalistic obviously planted outside enclosure. But I think there was a shift for tortoise keepers working with hingebacks, realizing that these guys really need to be indoors. And that takes space. And someone like Ryan Dumas, who's in the zoo world, he's been on a podcast and sharing what he does with Kinixys homiana, and he's had his colony a couple years, 2-3 years, and he's already producing babies. And his enclosures are, he's individually housing these guys. They've got everything that they could possibly want or need, and he's dedicating the space. He can't cram 100 tortoises in that facility. He can cram 8, but 8 is enough to, be part of that web of the Kinixys working group to help establish them.
So let's talk a little bit about the Kinixys Cooperative. So, at this point, you've come home from South Africa the first time, and you're super passionate and excited to kind of hit the ground running with this. And it sounds like that project, you started to have success with it. At what point did you think, I need to start something? Or was that that was part of that, working with them just to create something more professional?
It was kind of organic. It was pushed by different people. I had folks that I really respect saying, I'm going to pass the torch to you. It's, time for you to run with hingeback tortoises. And, I see it as my contribution to herpetoculture long term. Like, I don't ever plan to not work with them. So, I had someone say, when you call yourself the Kinixys Cooperative, you better be planning on working with Kinixys for a very long time. It's not like I'm calling myself the Tortoise Cooperative and I can just kind of shuffle in and out. It's like, no, you're pigeonholing yourself into a very small, genus. And, that's what I wanted. And that's what I needed as a keeper who's definitely worked with a bunch of different snakes and other species. So for me, it was more focus in on something, take it seriously long term. And yeah, I mean, I've said to my buddy who created my logo, putting a big logo on the center floor of my building, it's like, that building is going to be for hingeback tortoises forever. I'm not redoing that. So it's having the mentality. We all have ups and downs as keepers, of failures that really get you down, hatchings that, or an animal that comes around that really brings you up. But I really wanted a challenge. I never felt grabbed by anything that I worked with, as far as, I guess I just didn't find the species that challenged me. And I have. And every year, no matter how dialed I think a group is, working with now 6 of the 9 species, there's always going to be that species each year that you fail with, or you only hatch 3 or 4. Or with some Bensis, I've hatched 2 ever. So they've humbled me, and every one that you don't hatch is, that's that's what keeps me going. I think I love the challenge.
Was it kind of, because one thing that I see with, with reptile keepers in general is so many of us are just like kind of ADD with what we keep. It's like this, and you'll find a new species and you get one. Or was it in some ways almost a relief to focus on a genus, to go, I can actually like keep this one genus, work with the species within it, and block out all the other distractions?
For sure. And for me, it was totally putting on complete blockers towards anything else until I felt like I knew what I needed to be doing husbandry wise each and every day in order to succeed over a calendar year. And, since then, it's like, I'm not going to add any other tortoise species. One, I think that keeping hinge-back tortoises and having wild caught animals, like there's some inherent risk about adding another, say a species from Asia that is not, it doesn't have the same gut biome, and there's a potential risk there. But as I dabble, right, so like working with Carusha, working with Agurnia, working with some Claudius, it's focused on these little, side projects. And I don't like to call them projects, really. It's stuff that, the first animal I remember seeing at Benita's pet shop was her prehensile-tailed skinks that were living loose in the building on pothos hanging baskets with like climbing rope connecting them. And her colony lived up there in the shop and produced babies and were, super sassy. I remember, that's my first memory of her shop. So, they're side projects, but they're species that I really love, and they're easy as far as husbandry goes. So the couple things I dabble in are the zero stress species, where I said, there's an inherent amount of stress that comes with the Kinixys Cooperative, and anything that I choose to, work with on a small scale has to be zero stress. Like a gurney are just, a joy, and, Carusha are a joy. And as you get babies and the parents are taking care of their babies, it's like the workload is just not there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So why don't you lay out a little bit of the structure of the Kinixys Cooperative? What's the mission? I mean, I think everybody at this point could probably pick up on the mission, but what does it do for you, and how does it function?
Right. So the Kinixys Cooperative is what I call my personal facility. And I see myself, first and foremost, helping get the 4 major species in the United States established. So that's Kinixys specki, Homiana, Arosa, and Ngui. I do have, small groups of 3 other species. They're not prevalent enough to really establish yet, and they may never be. There's species that came in a long time ago and one that came in and didn't do well in the hobby. So it's that preservation side, right? Keeping them around in the hobby. There's the conservation side, which is something I'm super passionate about. Like, I enjoy being in the field as much as being in my tortoise building. And that's just supporting, right? So that's financially supporting the folks who are doing research and conservation. And then the education side, which I said at the beginning, I appreciate you having me on. More than anything, it's sharing about hinge-back tortoises. And a lot of folks like those old timers who I talked to at TTPG who failed with them, had wild caughts, and they didn't do well. There's a stigma around the genus that they're just going to die on you and they don't do well and they're impossible. And you need to, a friend of mine calls them nuclear tortoises. But as soon as you get captive born, that's a complete game changer. So, the Kinixys Cooperative was just, what I call what I'm doing. Those are kind of the 3 focuses of the Kinixys Cooperative. And, conferences like the TTPG conference really helped cement what I'm focused on, and, kind of birthed the Kinixys working group, which is the collaborative effort of, myself and hundreds of other keepers in the United States who are dedicated in some fashion to Hinge-Back tortoises, whether it's a pair or a bigger facility.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's what I think is great. It's a three-pronged model that anybody could use if they were wanting to work with a species that's maybe endangered or, close to being extinct, or just a species that, we know the wild habitat is being destructed or anything like that. You have a preservation side, which means you're working with the species, you're finding out what makes it tick, understanding how to make them breed, and trying to do your best to create robust captive bred colonies. Conservation means go find somebody who has boots on the ground working on that area, whether they're working with the species or working in the area to preserve the land or conserve the land. And then last is education. So making sure we're, doing a good job educating the public, or however you can. There's a million different ways to educate, whether it's doing a podcast or having a YouTube channel or going to do presentations. Anybody can take those three things and run with it.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that we all forget when we get passionate about a species or a genus, or say snakes as a whole, is that there are opportunities in your own backyard that are in your native range. Like, sure, it's awesome to go to South Africa and, do what I can with Hinge-Back tortoises. But, right in my backyard, there are endangered species. There are people working with those endangered species, and it's way more accessible and way less expensive to help with something like that in your own backyard. It's not necessarily something that you can do in the private sector. Maybe that endangered species protected and you can't keep it, but you can certainly, contribute to its conservation.
Yeah, absolutely. So then tell us about the second trip you went to South Africa. That was where you connected with Flora, I'm sure. And then what did you do that round?
Yeah, so the second trip was focused solely on Kinixys lobatiana. So she had, and that's Flora, had 5 or 6 sampling gaps, right? So she's finding that a lot of folks who do what she's doing are using museum samples solely. So she has museum samples, but she also, on her own time and on her own dollar, she got grants, but, her organization doesn't pay for the entire trip, which is going out there and getting her own samples, seeing exactly where these tortoises exist, she's got an awesome network in South Africa of people helping her. And she's German.
Is she an American? Oh, she's a German biologist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So she's from Germany, and right. So she's got a great network. She went out there and basically had sampling gaps of like, this is their range. And with a lot of species, it's like their range may look like a circle, say, but it's just little pockets where they actually exist. Mm-hmm. And there were outer perimeter missing pockets that she was looking to close. And these are, in some cases, places she's been 3-4 years in a row and not found a tortoise. But someone there says, I've seen the red tortoise, which is what they call Lobatse. And, so that was the focus, right? It's closing the sampling gaps and putting in the work to find tortoises in areas where they are in low population. So
how did you connect with her? You're looking for someone working with the species?
So when I went to South Africa with David at the end of the trip, we went to the Cape. So, southwestern South Africa, and connected with Dr. Margaretha Hofmeyer, who is unfortunately now passed, but she is like one of the biggest champions of South African herps and tortoises on the planet. She focused her work on the geometric tortoise, and did more for that tortoise than anyone else that I know. And, is just, that's someone that Flora really looks up to. And Retha, or Flora, was working under Retha's permits to be in South Africa, and they were collaborators. So when we went to go see Retha and she saw that I had the Kinixys bug, she was like, she just brought up Flora, and David had known of Flora, but wasn't super connected with her. I hadn't even heard the name, and she could tell I hadn't when she said it. She was like, wait, how do you not know who Flora is? You're in South Africa and you're digging around for these things, and you don't know the main researcher who's working on them. So, she said, here's her email, reach out when you get back. And I basically pestered the heck out of Flora, to learn as much as I could. And again, I'm a random private keeper who went, you know, tinkering around in the wild, looking for them, not knowing where to go and what to do. And, that was just, another nurtured relationship over a long period of time where, when she goes out, she likes to have help. She's also, any individual going out in South Africa, I think South Africa really is pretty safe. I felt safe while I was there, but there are areas, especially out in the middle of nowhere, like you're not in populated areas. So like there's some risk of being by yourself. She's also, a female out in South Africa by herself, and she's totally badass and can take care of herself, but it's nice to have help. So when she goes, she asks usually a friend to come out and assist her. And she was going for 6 weeks. That friend could go for 3. And I remember her basically sharing that she was a little stressed because the friend could only do 3 of the 6. And I was like, I'd love to go. Yeah. So, she thought about it, invited me. And again, like I met her for the first time tent camping or rooftop tent camping with her in South Africa. So yeah, it was, an awesome experience. That I'd say that trip changed my life too. And in a totally different way, because I was with an expert. I was with someone who knew exactly where to find them, how to find them. I just learned so much about Hinge-Backs as opposed to, the first time you go, you're just like overwhelmed with everything there, the megafauna, everything there. So the second time going, it was all business. It's not, you see a tortoise and you're hanging around watching what it does. It was like, we checked off that sampling gap and we're on the road to the next one, no matter what time of day it was.
Wow. What is her opinion of the private sector? Did you get a sense of that? Does she have issues with it or?
Yeah. So, we talked some about that. I just think that she is well aware and does not let the private sector kind of pull the wool over her eyes as far as like, all of those deaths that we were talking about. Like a huge shipment comes in and she knows how many survive. She has friends who are Hinge-Back keepers in Europe. So she's well aware of that. She also knows that everyone throws around, I'm a conservationist and I'm doing conservation. And she's like, you keep 6 tortoises in your basement. Like, yeah. She doesn't have like any resentment really. It's just more like, these people are crazy.
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't even know if she would say that she's doing conservation. She would say she's doing research. But you can't conserve a species that you don't know about. So she's researching, she's saying, this is where they are. This is the density. These are the potential threats. This is the ecology, and here are target places that are currently not protected that could be, so there's a ton of value in what she's doing. And fortunately, some of the places that they exist are already like really well protected.
Yeah, that is it's an incredible experience. I can't imagine how much that must have had an impact on you. And so I wanted to bring it back to Florida with your operation and just talk a little bit about you mentioned the Kinixys working group, because that's a huge part of, preservation. If you're working with a breeding colony and you're working with a species, there needs to be some genetic shuffling happening. And I imagine that was maybe the genesis for that idea. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the Kinixys working group as it is now was birthed at the TTPG, Turtle and Tortoise Preservation Group Conference in 2019 in Arizona. Anybody who's mildly interested in turtles and tortoises should go. Like, you link up with absolute legends who are happy to sit down and spend 2 hours talking with you about anything. It's not stuck up. It's not cliquey. It's super approachable folks who are awesome. But it was birthed there. However, the idea was birthed, I think, in 2012 or 2014 by David Mifsud. He tried to pull a working group together. Whether he called it that or not, it was like, let's all collaborate and work together to keep Hinge-Backs around. And at the time, there just wasn't the interest. There wasn't, I think it did help that myself and others who are starting to hatch these share them around on social media, and like people became more familiar with the genus, helped, the Kinixys working group really start rolling. So David Mifsud, Andrew Hermes, Tyler Brooks, Tom Arbor, and myself are all co-founders of the working group. We all work with different species. We all do it a little differently, but we're all dedicated to the genus. Some of them have had them, 20 plus years. So it's folks who are really serious about them. And I think all of us add something different. Some folks have, great conservation contacts. Some folks just crank them out. A lot of us are willing to gift some of the hatchlings away. Andrew Hermes, when he hatches them, he just says, "Hey, I'm shipping it to you. You figure out where it needs to go in the working group." Awesome. So he's not worried about, I could sell this for X amount of money. And that's true of every single co-founder of the working group. So, the idea there was one person can do something on an island, but a group of people can do something that's going to last a lot longer. So if one of us, for whatever reason, stops working with the genus, if a Kinixys working group is established where there are hundreds of people working with these guys, the genus will be just fine. So, it allows Hinge-Back tortoises to tolerate some folks who do get in and get out, because there are always the folks within the working group who have been cranking them out for 20 years and will crank them out for the next 20 years and really take them seriously. So
how does it function? Like, what are you guys, is it basically like a stud book type thing, or how, I'm sure you have the animals tracked across the country?
Yeah, so we have the keepers tracked and what species they work with tracked across the country. As far as the stud book goes, that's something that we talked with James Badman about, who started the Galapagos Tortoise Alliance, which is basically the private sector keeping track of, a stud book for Galapagos tortoises. And so that's something in the future. It's something that we'll definitely do. As far as the stud book, we all keep track of our own bloodlines, and there aren't that many of us. So, we are aware of who's got what and, where animals ought to shuffle. But yeah, more than anything, it's just a presence, of an umbrella or a front for, if you have a Hinge-Back, reach out. A lot of times someone may have a pair and they'll reach out to me and say, "I've had these for 10 years. I'd like to send them to you." And maybe 6 years ago, I would have said, "Awesome, that sounds great." And I definitely have taken on single animals. At this point, I would be saying to that person who's got a pair, instead of sending them here, basically, all your eggs in one basket, let's send them all to Jeremy or send them all to Andrew or David. I'll just share with you what I'm doing, and then you start producing them. Because the more people producing them, the better off Hinge-Backs are in the States. So, I think the working group has done a great job at educating. Tom is constantly answering questions on social media from new keepers who, get a tortoise and then say, "How do I keep this?" Which is, unfortunate for the animal. And I definitely don't recommend that. I recommend, digging through either my website or the Kinixys Conservation Blueprint or Tom Arbor's YouTube channel or any of the Facebook groups before you decide to add one. But he's there to basically catch those folks who just get one, and he has the patience and, the experience to help them along, which is awesome. That's a huge asset for the working group.
So do you guys have, is there like an online area where you can meet, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we do have I think it's a private Facebook page. So basically anyone who wants to join, there's a link on my website, thekinixyscooperative.com, or you can private message any of the co-founders, and we will send you, it's like a Google survey Basically, we learn some information about what you have, what you keep, what you want to keep. You don't have to keep anything to be part and to contribute. There are folks who, like there's an importer and exporter on there. There's Flora Elo on there, Dr. Flora Elo, a researcher. There's Dwight Lawson, who's the curator of the Oklahoma City Zoo. Like there's all these different folks on there. Not all of them keep Hinge-Backs. Not all of them are focused in the private sector, but those folks will fill out that survey. We'll get back to them basically as soon as we can. One of us will look at it, and then you're added to that, that private group. And, at least that group itself is private so that we can keep track of who's got what. And it's like, that's really the only community that we have for the working group online. But there's also a Kinixys working group page, where we'll share stuff that different members are hatching. I say members, there's no fee. It's nothing like that. It's really just trying to group everyone who could help Hinge-Back tortoises in education, conservation, or preservation in any way, and pull them together.
Yeah. It's a really good idea. And I think it, like you said, it's strength in numbers and everybody's focused on the same thing. So things won't collapse easily when you have a giant network kind of built together. I thought maybe we could just sort of wrap up just talking about your facility. You've mentioned it a couple of times. I'm curious to see kind of what that is like, and then maybe we'll just sort of dabble a little bit in how you care for them, and we'll wrap up with that.
Sure. So my facility was, our house in Colorado when we were in Colorado. I've since moved back to Florida, and my facility here is, a 40 by 30 building dedicated to Hinge-Back tortoises.
Is it on your property?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's on my property, and the, long term, the wild caught collection and anything that has been exposed to the wild caught collection will be in that building. And I'm right now working on a rearing building where any offspring will go. So really, it's where any egg will go. So an egg's disinfected. Like at this point, I always say knock on wood, but I feel really comfortable and established with the collection that I've got. It is a closed collection, which I think is important. Occasional captive born offspring that are like a week old get transferred or passed around to help with, the working group. But I'm not taking in to that facility any more wild caught adults. If a female Labatsiana popped up, I would change that and I would figure it out because they're just not around, and there's one in the country. But, as far as the imports and exports that are happening, my collection's closed. I think it's really the way forward to, you can always have the mentality of I need to add more, I need to grow. And for me, it's if I want to grow, I need to produce it from within and raise it up and put that time in instead of, there are some keepers who do an awesome job just with wild caught species, and they sell every baby they produce. And some of those are friends of mine who have shared, I produced 400 every year, not of Hinge-Backs, of different species. And I decided to get rid of them. And now I'm trying to find my babies and I can't, where did they all go? And so, it's stay focused with the group, close the collection down. So that's the main building. I use stock tanks as enclosures. So 6 and 8 foot stock tanks. Stuff is individually housed, 99% of them. Even juveniles are individually housed because even babies can go and bully each other and bite each other and get nasty. And, they've got a hide, they've got substrate to dig and burrow in. The hide that I use is a half of a clay pot so that they can kind of go down as if it was a little burrow. It's not fancy. I shared from the beginning, it's, getting into turtles and tortoises to put together an elaborate enclosure. And that ends up being an Agurnia enclosure or a Carusha enclosure, because what I've found for keeping Hinge-Backs is, keeping them fairly simple where you can pick up on those little cues where you're seeing the animal every single day. You're seeing its defecations, you're seeing how much it eats, always access to clean water, an area to soak. And, it's fairly simple. So, that's my setup. I've shared, photos of my setup, and I'm happy to share one right after the podcast so that it's kind of a refresher of, this is my building and this is how I keep them.
And what about lighting and heating? Is that all overhead or?
So the building is climate controlled.
Mhm.
One thing I really learned while in South Africa was, of all the time that Flora spent on the ground, she's found like two or three young tortoises, and I think only one that she would call a hatchling. They're obviously more prevalent than the adults, or at least as prevalent as the adults. However, they hide all the time.
Like
It's
they're burrowed?
correct. Yeah. Well, we don't know exactly what they're doing. She hasn't found them. So, whether they're under leaf litter or they're burrowed down. David and I did find on our trip, the first Labatsiana we found was not alive. And it was a little hatchling that was down in like a little rodent burrow in a rocky outcropping. And
How the hell did you find that?
with a flashlight.
Wow.
And we saw it. We were so excited and gave each other a big hug. And we're like, oh my God, we found one. And we pulled it out. And unfortunately, it wasn't alive. And it was just like
Oh,
a
no.
crusher. But, it showed us like these little guys are hidden away. And if you would look at the landscape of like 10 trillion rocks, a friend of ours, Courtney Hundermark, who's in South Africa doing awesome stuff, he had always said, I find Labatsiana young by flipping rocks. He's a snake guy. So he's flipping a rock for a snake and he's seeing a baby Hinge-Back under there. Right.
Wow.
So as far as lighting goes, I like the Arcadia Shade Dweller. I think it fits all Hinge-Back tortoises, whether they're a forest species like a Rosa and Homiana, or, a savanna species, if you want to call it that, like Speckeye. So I like the Shade Dweller. They definitely don't love bright lights. When a wild caught comes in, it's basically keep it dark and leave it be. But they are omnivores, so they're eating animal protein. So they're getting stuff from animal protein. Arcadia Shade Dweller, and as far as like heating and cooling, the building stays between 58 and 85 degrees, and I just use a mini split to regulate the building through that cycle. So it's not like they don't like it hot. They don't want a hot basking light. Some folks, like folks who keep it inside, literally in their house, might need a little basking lamp to help warm it up, but they're not in my house.
Mm. And so as far as feeding, are you mostly feeding insects or just, crickets and whatnot?
It's mostly salads. So it's tossed greens, zucchini, yellow squash, mushrooms. And then, so that's the staple. And then it's adding something to that. So there are protein days where they would get animal protein, like, frozen thawed rodents, frozen thawed quail, shrimp, pellets. I use pellets rarely. Hingebacks are low metabolism animals, so throwing a bunch of pelleted diets at them, I don't find as great. But so it's that salad staple, adding animal protein. I personally do it once a week. And, I don't think scheduling that out is ideal for like enrichment. If you have three tortoises, like play around with that. Ryan Dumas will throw them an entire chick and they have to like tear it apart, right? So they're using all those muscles and it's more natural. I have a big collection, or fairly big, for tortoises. So, I'm scheduling that out just to, ease that on myself.
Sure. And then just as far as we never even talked about how, like, what they look like and sort of the size they get, because they're not huge tortoises, but they do have beautiful shells. And maybe you could just kind of I know there's a few species, but just give us a crash course on their appearance.
Yeah. So I think they're all gorgeous, right? So another thing said about Hingebacks is they're just ugly brown turtles. And go look through my page, go look through the Kinixys working group page. They're really not. And captive born, grown under husbandry that we now like keep them high humidity, feed them properly, give them some lighting. Even young can tolerate no lighting. Like they still do great because they really are almost fossorial when they're young. They're gorgeous and they develop amazing patterns. Like a Rosa anybody who keeps star tortoises or radiated tortoises, Arosa are every bit as pretty, if not more, than those species. And those are species that the hobby really latched onto because they are gorgeous and attractive. So, I would challenge anybody who doesn't think they're, at least has in their head that like, they're just another tortoise. Go dig through maybe my Instagram page or Facebook page and take a look at some of these guys. It is a tortoise that ranges from like the smallest is like a Natalensis, which is not in the hobby, but it's 4 or 5 inch adult, to like an Arosa that's, a big Arosa is maybe 12 or 13 inches, but that is like an enormous outlier male. Like the average one is maybe 10 inches and females are a little bit shorter and more squatty. So, anybody could keep a Specs Hinge-Back tortoise baby alive. I would say that is definitely a beginner. If you want, to put your foot in the door with Hinge-Back tortoises, either Spec-Eye or Homiana, they're widely produced in the States now. I would say that they're established or on their way to being established. It's a species that I would personally feel okay sending to a new keeper or someone who I know may waffle and may change their mind, because I think they're ultra hardy. They don't get big. A Spec-Eye is, like 7-inch tortoise, really flat on top, long and narrow. They have awesome personality. They remind me of a Testudo, right? So like Egyptian tortoise or something. They are marching around their enclosure all the time. They've got a lot of energy. Especially males are awesome. And Homiana is more of that forest dwelling, big eyes, again, gorgeous shell, cryptic. They've got like a serrated shell, so they look really awesome. And it's kind of the Spec-Eye or those high energy tortoises. Homiana are like more subdued species. So it's also like, I think that can fit a keeper well, whether a keeper wants something that's like out and about or something that's like, at the captive born that's the tortoise you build an awesome planted, elaborate, gorgeous enclosure with a water feature for, because they are rock solid. They have no parasites. They're, ready to rock in captivity, and they would thrive in an enclosure like that. And I have set them up in enclosures like that, and others have too. So, for someone, looking to work with them, go captive born. I would say any of the big four, Ngui, Spec-Eye, Arosa, or Homiana, great options. Every single year within the working group, those are hatched and available. And again, in some cases, the working group is going to just donate or place animals with keepers that we feel are super serious about, working with them long term. So yeah, it's an awesome genus that I definitely adore. Small and manageable. And, I think something I learned from a mentor, Greg Sage, who runs Select Aquatics. He is a fish guy, an older guy who, really shared a lot of knowledge with me. I didn't share my fish experience, but being part of the fish world and my grandma being really a big part of the fish world, Greg Sage was someone that I got to spend time with when I was in Colorado. He's in Erie, Colorado. And, it's something that I think needs to be said in the hobby, which is the keeper is as important, if not more important, than the species. And obviously we all love these animals. And I would say I love the species way more than the keeper. However, his point is basically, if you do not find keepers other than yourself that are serious, that are going to work with a species, they will disappear and the species will no longer be around. So, it's easy to, he works with rare fish. So, right, he sends out a rare fish species, someone fails with them. They're embarrassed and they never reach back out to him because they killed this rare species of fish. And obviously fish reproduce on a different scale than reptiles, but I think the model is important, which is he says, and always shared with me, I want that person to reach out. I want them to share all of their parameters with me. And I want to be able to tell them, this is where you might be failing. I'm going to send you some more. if you're really serious about the species, you are the person that I want working with the species.
Mhm.
Don't be embarrassed. Obviously that's not what you want when you send something out, but people do fail with species, and people who are, I think of the guys who are awesome keepers who failed with those wild caughts, who are like gun shy to try and contribute to the working group because they initially failed. Greg Sage would say those are the exact people that need to be working with these guys. They're the
Mhm.
dedicated keepers who have been keeping stuff forever, long term, or a completely newbie who, you know, comes on the Facebook page, says, "Hey, I got a wild caught Homiana. Can you help me, Tom?" And it's so far gone, it perishes. And the person's like, that ruined Kinixys for them. That's the person who really had a passion for that wild caught animal that they saw at a pet shop or at an expo, that the Kinixys working group wants to pass captive born offspring to be part of that working group and to contribute going forward. So, the keeper is very important, and the keepers around you, new or experienced, are important if you're trying to establish a species in the private sector. It's nice to, you know, I'm the only person producing this species in the country, and you hear that often, or I'm the first. But, I think someone can be way more proud about saying, as a group, we have 200 individuals that hatched X species this year, and they're now established. And at one point they weren't. So, that drives me. That drove the working group. That drove the Kinixys Cooperative. And I think it's a nugget that we can take. There's other nuggets from the fish industry that I think are important, but that's a big one that kind of stuck. Where we're so quick to judge someone who fails, with an animal, or shame them. But sometimes those people could be the next person who is going to just crush it for 20 years with that species if they were just given another chance.
Yeah, that is incredibly wise advice. And just thinking about that, thinking about this group of keepers that we can, great keepers can create more great keepers. And we also will replace poor keepers, bad keepers, people who are doing those mass imports and don't give a shit, and they're just letting these animals die in the backyard, and because they're just hoping to get a couple so they can sell them off at a higher price because now you have a captive bred rare animal. We can replace that attitude and that behavior by creating groups like you're talking about, and having that attitude of bringing people under the fold. And yeah, if they do fail, okay, this is where you failed, this is where we can do better next time. And we're just looking for people who have the right attitude, really. And they don't have to have the skill set, they just need to have the right mindset.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the mindset. And I think the Kinixys working group has um, drawn people to it who have that mindset, right? That, like, we put out, this is what we're about. And we have not had a single person that wanted to join or has joined that's been a detriment at all. Like, all of those folks are, people motivate each other. You might not be having success, but you see someone else having success. And it's like, I don't know, it's just more of a collective group mindset that I don't see enough in the hobby. It's the one person who's doing amazing with a species and crushing it. And I get more of the feel that it's at times like I'm cornering that market. That's something I heard a lot in the snake industry. Like, I've got that market cornered. I'm the only person, and I'm not sharing how I do it. That's huge. Like, you have to share the information. Like, I'm a totally open book. I share just a tiny bit of husbandry. If you're working with Hinge-Back tortoises and you have a question, the working group will share exactly how we're doing it. It's not the old school mentality of, keeping that, close to my chest, and saying, well, I'm doing it, you figure it out yourself. I'm only here because people shared with me. Like, I didn't figure it out myself. Like, 10% maybe of what I'm doing, I figured out myself through failing. And I can share that with someone else, and maybe 5% they fail and they figure the other 5% out themselves. But, it's plucking from David and Ralph and Will and James and people who don't even keep tortoises. I learned quarantine through a snake breeder that I worked for a long time. Like, quarantine is something that we throw to the wayside a lot of times. You're hearing it come up more with the different viruses and issues in herpetoculture, but I plucked that from a snake breeder. So
Mhm.
we're all, you know, grouping those things from other people and learning, but you got to be willing to share what you've learned in order, it's putting that information out there and putting that species first before, whatever you think you might be doing on an island by yourself.
Yeah, yeah. There's that collaborative sort of collective that really can strengthen the community, and I mean, at the end of the day, very few people make a lot of money breeding reptiles, and that's a pipe dream that gets sold to a lot of people. But you have to be passionate, and maybe that's where some of that cornering the market kind of attitude comes from, because someone's trying to protect their livelihood, and I don't need you breeding the species next door to me that I just sold you a pair, whatever. But if we are actually wanting to look like respectable, responsible people in society who are working with these animals, not just because we want to pull them from the wild and have cages in our bedroom with them, living in our houses, we need to prove that that's not the only thing we're here for. And I think that what you've laid out today is exactly the method or one of the methods for doing that.
Yeah. And I like that shift that you just said, or that correction of like, it is one of the methods. It is only one of the methods. I'm not here to say, this is how I'm doing it and this is how you need to do it. And there's one way.
Mm-hmm.
There are multiple ways to do that. And I think, this part of the hobby that is focused on something more um, is a is a part of the hobby. It's not the whole hobby. There's, the big breeders who are needed to be around, and they're, the, individual keeper who just wants to keep a bearded dragon, and that's important too. So, you know, yeah, like I took the model for a lot of this stuff from other people, and we talked a lot about hingebacks, but again, this can correlate to any group of animals. The species right now that are coming into the country for cheap, wild caught, that no one's taking seriously, will be gone at some point in the hobby if no one takes them up and works with them, regardless of what you can make financially on them or not. And I realize not everyone can just take on a money pit to just throw money into. But at the same time, if something catches your eye and you're like, well, it's only $15 or it's only $20, work with it anyways. Work with what you're interested in, and set up some of those species that are coming in that no one else that works with, and figure those species out and focus. I think I admire some of the folks who can keep a bunch of different stuff. Like some folks in Europe are just amazing at keeping a smattering of super rare species, and they're dialed in and they're doing great with them. It's definitely people here in the States, in Canada as well. And, I admire those people, but I do think that, for myself and some other folks out there who might feel like lost in what they're currently working with or not passionate about what they're working with, focus in on something that you are passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good advice. And I think if anything, you've highlighted just how powerful the private sector can be, and how much of a positive force we can be, which is exactly what we try to talk about on the podcast and what we need to be promoting all the time. So this was a mind-blowing conversation, Jeremy. I really appreciate you coming on. Can you let everybody know where they can find everything about you online?
Sure. So the Kinixys Cooperative, at Kinixys Co-op on Instagram and Facebook. The KinixysCooperative.com is my website. It's not fancy. There is a cool education section there where anybody who has published a paper on Hinge-Back tortoises, who has given me permission to host their paper there, is hosted. So multiple different people who have done research or whatever they've done on Hinge-Back tortoises, in the education tab, you can go and read their paper, which I think is great. The Kinixys working group, you can find at Kinixys WG, I think it is, on Instagram, but look for Kinixys working group, same on Facebook. And, come meet us all in person at TTPG one year. It's every November, usually the weekend before Thanksgiving. And again, a really close friend of mine who's here locally to me, I wouldn't call him a tortoise guy, but he's definitely a passionate and skilled reptile keeper who's cranking out stuff that people would be blown away by. Like Tyler is another close friend of mine who is a Kinixys guy. Him and I are dragging him to TTPG and basically just said, you know, you just got to be around these people. Like you leave those meetings like charged up, ready to go and crush it even more. So anybody who's able to make it to those meetings or the TSA meeting, the Turtle Survival Alliance conference, there's awesome conferences in Europe if you're not in the US. And do you all have conferences out by you?
We do, but honestly, a lot of people will travel to the States to go to those conferences because they're typically drawing a much more, a lot more people end up attending them.
Okay. Yeah. So, go to one of those. Like you will just, and there are plenty of folks who go who have zero experience. They're really just going to hear talks, and it's really not long term about the talks. It's about all the conversations you have. So that's where you can find me. Come meet me in person at the conference. I think it'll change your life.
Awesome. Well, Jeremy, I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for sharing your story and sharing your model. And I know people will learn a lot from this. So thank you very much for joining me on that episode.
Appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Okay, that is the end of that conversation. Jeremy, thank you so much for jumping on an episode. I had a blast chatting with you, and I know that we talked kind of back and forth afterwards. We both really enjoyed the conversation, and I know there's probably more to unpack there, so eventually we'll have to have you back on, and we can talk a little bit more about this. But I think the model that you laid out, and the model that, to the listeners, the model that Jeremy laid out in this episode is something, as we said at the end, it's not something you have to do, and it's not the only way to help improve the reptile lives on the planet, but it is one of the ways, and I think it is such an easy framework to follow. If there's a genus or a species that sort of fits the bill for this sort of project, then I really hope we can motivate people to at least start thinking about how you might incorporate a similar type of organization into your life, or if there's something that you can, maybe you and a couple of friends who are working with similar species can start something similar. And again, it's all about showing people who are outside of herpetoculture how serious we are, how passionate we are, and how that we're not just about keeping animals in boxes. That is why this podcast exists. We want to make sure that that's not the only message we give out to people. Yes, it's amazing to keep animals at home and to be able to keep species and watch with them and interact with them on a daily basis, but we owe it to the animals to make sure that we're doing more than just that. And this is a perfect framework to follow for promoting a sort of a deeper meaning and a deeper purpose behind keeping reptiles. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you share it on Instagram or social media, or just come onto the YouTube version of the video and give it a like and a comment. Of course, that helps the algorithm there as well. You can also give us a rating on Apple or Spotify if you're someone who's listening to the audio-only platform. That does really go a long way to helping our visibility in those apps. Make sure you go to animalsathome.network.com for more information on this episode or any other. Thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. For those of you who are aware, I keep mentioning it, and the project is happening very slowly, but we are making some big changes in my podcast studio that is all Custom Reptile Habitat sponsored. And it's happening slowly because I am just so slow at doing the work in here. I have very little time during my week, so I can eke out a couple, maybe 1 hour a week to work on things. And but it'll get done, and I cannot wait for it to be done and take you guys along for that ride. And if you would like to support the podcast in another way financially, you can do that over at Patreon at patreon.com/animalsathome. There you can join our community, jump into the Discord server, have conversations with other like-minded keepers. It's one of my favorite parts about the Patreon group is that Discord server just keeps bubbling on its own. I can see keepers interacting with each other and sharing ideas and sharing pictures of their animals, and it's so wonderful to see that. And if you would like to be part of that community, you can do that over through Patreon. And that is it. I cannot wait to share the next episode with you. We have a couple great episodes coming up. I always say that. They're all great. I continue to enjoy sharing my conversations with people from the herpetoculture community with you guys, and I cannot wait to continue doing that. I'll catch you in the next episode.